Before we start this video, a large thank you to Devamitra, Shuku, and Kagate for their support on Patreon. I hope you guys enjoy the video. And a special thank you to Halo Burner for their immense support of the channel this month on Patreon. It is greatly appreciated, my friend, and I hope you enjoy the video. Hello everybody, today we're going to add some effects to our take damage, and we're also going to track the players that join the game. So I've got a little blood splatter effect here, and I just made this real quick. I modified it for something I already had. I'm going to link right now on screen and in the description where you can get some particle effects if you don't want to make your own. So whenever you got them, you can pause the video and then come back, and as soon as you have them here, we can go over to the Character Effects Manager. And what we want to do here is make a variable for the blood splatter effects. But now most of your characters are probably going to use the same effects, so we're only going to put this here if this is, say, a standout creature. Like say you have a monster that you want to have bone meal pop out of instead of a blood splatter. Well, you can just use that here in place of that. So I'm going to make a header, call it VFX, call the game object blood splatter VFX. Next, I'm going to make a public void for play blood splatter VFX. And now what we're going to do is make this require a vector 3 for the contact point. You remember we made a contact point in our take damage effect a long time ago. So we're going to check, and if we do have this here, it means we want to manually use the blood splatter VFX from our Character Effects Manager. And if this is null, then we're just going to use the default one that most characters will share, and we're going to put that on our World Character Effects Manager. So I'm going to make a comment here as to why we have this here, just so if we come back a long time from now, it's quite obvious. If we manually have placed a blood splatter VFX on this model, we play this version, else we use the default version on the World Character Effects Manager. Now, why are we doing this? Because if you're serious about a project and the scope of your project is quite large, you probably are going to have dozens of enemies, or at least 5 to 10. So every time you make a prefab, you might have different versions of the same enemy also. You would have to drag this in manually. That can get pretty tedious. So since most people will probably share the same blood color and the same blood effect, we can just use a general effect and put that on the World Character Effects Manager. Now, we're going to instantiate it here. We're going to say game object blood splatter equals instantiate, and we're going to instantiate a copy of the original, and then we're going to use the contact point for its position in the world space and quaternion identity for its rotation. So it's just that simple. Now, I'm going to make a variable for blood splatter VFX on the World Character Effects Manager, so we can just copy this in its entirety and jump over there real quick and do that. So World Character Effects Manager, and you can put this anywhere you want. I'm just going to separate it from our actual effects. And by actual effects, I mean stuff like take damage, blocking effects. So this will go into its own class, what it will call just VFX. Okay, I'm going to make this public too, so we can access it from anywhere in the project, and that is good to go. Now, alternatively, you can make it private, and you can just use a getter method for it, just having a function, and just have it return that game object if you're paranoid about making it public. But I'm going to keep it public because I find it's just so much more simple, and I like it that way. So I'm going to go over to the take damage effect now, and let's see, we have take or play damage VFX and play damage sound effects. So let's make a function for the VFX first. Private play damage VFX. And then we can open up some curly brackets in here. Let's make some comments for what we want to do. Well, if we have, say, fire damage, this is in the future, we're going to play a fire damage sound effect on top of the regular damage, or particle effect, sorry, on top of the regular blood splatter particle effect. Likewise, if you have lightning, you might want to play like a little zap or a lightning particle effect as well. That's just polished stuff, though. I'm just making the comments here, so if you guys want some other stuff to add yourself, you can go ahead and do that. I'll come back to it eventually, but it's not important right now compared to what else we could be doing. So I'm going to make this require a character manager, and I'm going to say character dot character effects manager, and then we're just going to call upon the newly created play blood splatter VFX. We're going to pass the contact point, and as you know, we always have a contact point on the take damage effect whenever we instantiate one, and then we can call play damage VFX just up here like that. Okay, let's jump over to the game here and save this as a prefab if you just made one, and then delete it from the scene. And then you want to drag your actual prefab into the variable here of blood splatter VFX and World Character Effects Manager. Now, if I go into the game here, I'm going to hit myself. You can see, yep, blood did pop up, but you're going to notice I'm not holding a sword, but on the client end, I actually am. This isn't so much a bug as it is something we just haven't implemented yet, and I'll explain why right now. But yeah, the blood splatter effect is working as intended. Awesome. So you can see here, though, they also don't delete from the scene. We're going to remedy that too by deleting them after a certain amount of time with a utility script. So let's handle the utility part first, and then we'll handle syncing the weapon. So we're going to make a script called utility_destroy after time. And it's going to be very straightforward, just a singular line of code on awake. So we can open that up, erase the start and update functionality as is per tradition, and then make a singular variable of a float or an int if you want. I'm going to put in my namespace first. And just this will be the time that you want to destroy this object after it spawned. So I'm going to say 5. That's a pretty good time for most effects. So float time until destroyed equals 5. And then on awake, all you do is say destroy, comma, and pass the time. If you hover over the game object destroy, it'll say the tooltip, the optional amount of time to delay before destroying the object. So there you go. Okay, let's talk about why that sword is invisible when we join. So if we go to the player manager, you can see the variable for syncing our weapon is basically on an on-call event. We do this when the variable is changed using onValueChanged. But if I switch to my sword before you join and then you join me, well, that variable has never changed since you've been joined, so it's not actually syncing my weapon. Now this is pretty easy to fix. All we have to do is make another function here to load other players if you join the game late, because basically this will only apply to you if you're joining an active game. If you're the host, this never matters. So if some stuff happens, say I switch my armor or my weapon and then a guy joins afterwards, those variables haven't changed since he's joined, so that logic never fires. So again, we remedy this by making this function. I'm going to call load other player character when joining server. Okay, so let's make it require a player manager called other player. What do we do here? Well, it's really, really easy. I'm just going to make a comment here saying sync weapons, because in the future we're going to sync armor, and if you have a character customization, you're going to sync hairstyles, etc., etc. But all you got to do is call other player. I'm just going to call this other player with a lowercase o, because that should not be an uppercase, dot player network manager, and then we just basically call all the functions that would need to be called to sync any of our equipment or anything that would be noticeable. So let's go to the player network manager, and I believe we just called these on right weapon change, yes, and on left weapon change. So we're going to say on current right weapon ID change 0, and then pass the current right hand weapon ID of the other player network manager. So all it does is just refreshes their weapon on our end using whatever their network ID is for the current right hand weapon. Do the same for the left, and you're good to go, because that's all we have right now for equipment variables. So how do we call this function? Therein lies the problem, because we need to call it for every player we connect to. Say if we join a game with 3 other people, we need to call this on all 3 of their models. So we need a way to know who is in the game with us. So to do that, we're going to make a new function, private void on client connected callback. Then I'm going to say it's going to require an oolong for client ID. Now, why am I naming it this specifically? Well, we're going to attach this to an event when a client connects using on-network spawn. So let me show you. It's very simple. All you do right up here is say network manager.singleton, and I can't access a singleton. Maybe I don't think I'm actually using unity.netcode as a library on this object. That's probably why. So I'm just going to go up here. Yeah, I'm not using that. So let's just add that. If you don't have that, add that already using unity.netcode. So yeah, we're going to access this event by saying network manager.singleton, and then we're going to say on client connected callback plus equals, and then we're going to use our newly on client connected callback. So basically I just named it the exact same thing so it's not confusing. This is an extension of that callback. And now inside of here we can do some stuff. So let's make some comments along what we want to do. Well, we need to keep a list of the active players in the game, and this list is going to change as people join and leave. And then from there, we're going to check basically if we are not the server and if we're the owner of this object. Why are we checking if we're not the server? Well, like I said before, if you're the server, it means you're the host. And if you're the host, you don't need to sync other people because you're seeing them when they join immediately. You're never joining late. So basically, their equipment is going to sync as soon as they join for you all the time. So I'm just going to make a comment. If we are the server, we are the host, so we don't need to load other players to sync them. You only need to load other players if you join a game late. So just anything like that, as long as it makes sense to you, you can type it out however you want. Okay, so now that we have a on-client connected callback, which again is going to load when a client connects to the game, we need a way to keep track of a list of the players, and then we can run some logic in here to sort through the list and load all the players and their equipment. So I'm going to do that by making a world game session manager, and I'm just going to attach that to our world network manager because that's already in the scene here now. And it kind of goes hand in hand with the network manager because in the future, when we hook this up through Steam, we're going to kind of use a lot of functionality that requires the transport, but more on that later in the future. So namespace SG, dropping your namespace, delete, start, and update as is per tradition. I'm sure your namespace is probably not SG. I'm going to make a header for active players in session. And this is just going to be a list of player managers. I'm going to call it players. So pretty simple here. We're only going to use two functions on this so far. One for adding players to the list and one for removing them from the list. So I'm going to make a public void add player to active players list. Going to make it require a player manager. Going to call that new player. Actually, I'm just going to call it player because I'm going to make one for remove players from active list too, and I can just also call that player. Okay, so what do we do here? Well, if you want to be extra safe, you can make sure that your list doesn't already contain the player you're trying to add. So we could just say if players does not contain player, then add them. Just so you don't want to add the same player twice on accident. That would not be good. And then after that, we also want to always check for this list for nulls in case something happens. And you want to just delete any potential null entries in the list. It could happen for a number of reasons, an error in the code or some weird thing with the list. If someone kind of disconnects without removing themselves using another function. At any rate, whenever we're editing the list, we should always check for nulls in the list and remove them. So I'm just going to do that by saying for I is equal to players as in the list.count. And then I'm going to say -1. And if I is greater than -1, I minus. And we can keep reusing this function for any list that we want to check. Because basically, if you sometimes remove something from a list, there's still an entry in the list, and it's null, but the entry still exists, so the list is still the same size. So then we would use if players I is equal to null, we would say players.remove at I, and this removes that slot entirely. I'm going to copy and paste that and put that down here when we remove something from the list, because it's going to be more important down here also. So then we're going to say over here on remove player from active players list, players.remove player. And if you want, you can make sure they're there first by just saying if players contains player, then remove them. All right, cool. So we have a method of adding and removing players from a list. I'm just going to edit the comments here so they reflect the actual function. Now what do we do? Well, we want to add every player to this list as soon as they connect. So let's go over to the player manager. And then right here where it says keep a list of active players in game, what you want to do is make first this a static world game session manager instance. So let's make a singleton of the world game session manager so we can actually access it from the player manager. We're going to say if instance equal null, instance is equal to this, else destroy this game object. And if you want to, again, you can use a getter and setter if that makes you nervous. I like doing it this way more personally, just preference though. So keep a list of active players in the game session manager dot instance dot add players to the game, and then we add this player here. So we just say this. Okay, so down here in is server and if is owner, we're just going to say for each player inside the active players list, so it's just players under world game session manager, we want to check first if this player is not us because we don't need to load our own equipment. It's already loaded. So if the player in this list is not us, then we're just going to say player.otherplayer.load player. So we need to make this public now, just like that. And then we'd say load other player character from joining server and then pass them, so the player. And now I'm thinking about it, we actually don't need to pass them. We can just delete it and have it reference itself. So let's just do that. That's a lot more simple and less confusing. Remove this, and instead of just remove other player because it will reference this as in the player script that it's on, running this function on, and then we're good to go. Okay, so now basically when you join, if someone has their gear changed from the default of what it's supposed to be, and you join late, that should sync up fine now, and this should work. So now if I go into the game here, and I go and stop my host and start as a client, you can see as I join this other character, they've already had a sword equipped, and yes, it is present. So this is how we're going to sync equipment and other things like having a bow drawn and stuff in the future as well. We're going to come back to this function. You can see here my world session manager is working. I have 2 people connected. So that's working as intended. Now let's add some sound effects when you get hit. So right here, play damage sound effects. Let's just make a function for that. And I'm going to show an asset on screen now where you can get some free damage sound effects. I'll have the link in the description. I'm going to use some that I have from Nephilim because it's just easier for me to drop them into the project. Now I have checked these out and gave them a list myself. They do sound really good, I gotta say, and they're free, so that's excellent. You got some whooshes in there and a lot of general hit sound effects. So again, I will link this in the description below. So I'm going to make this function called play damage sound effects. And again, if you want to make a couple comments here, if the fire damage is greater than 0, then maybe you want to play some burn sound effects on top of your regular sound effects. If your lightning damage is greater than 0, maybe you want to play some zapping sound effects on top of your regular sound effects. But for now, we're going to do the mandatory regular sound effects. So luckily we have a world sound effect manager where we can keep a bunch of sound effects that will be used. Because normally you'd probably cache these on your character so you can load them from character, but then you got to drag it into every new prefab you make. But we have them on the World Sound Effect Manager. You can just get them from one place. It is so much more convenient. So I'm going to make a header for damage sounds. I'm going to make a public audio clip array, and we can call this physical damage sounds, or if you want default damage sound effects, I'm just going to use SFX so it shorthands it. And I'm going to lock this and drag in all of my physical damage sounds I've dragged over from Nephilim. If you have some from a package you've downloaded or you already have them in your project, drag them in now. Next, I'm going to make an audio clip variable on take damage. I'm going to call this physical damage sound effect. I'm going to initialize it null. We're going to change that in a second. Then I'm going to say character.character sound effects manager, and I see we don't have that right now, so I guess we haven't called that. So let's go open up our character manager. Let's use the keyword hide in inspector so we don't see this. Let's make public character sound effect manager variable, call it character sound effects manager. And on awake, we're just going to grab that by saying character sound effects manager is equal to get component character sound effects manager. Okay, now we can go over here, and I can't recall if I've made a general sound effect function. I don't think I did, but I'm going to check. So character.character sound effect manager play, and no I don't. We only have a rolling sound effect. So let's go make a general sound effect function. We're going to use this a lot through the series. So character sound effects manager, and wherever you want to put it, I'm just going to call it play sound effect. Now we're going to put a few extra variables here that we're going to autofill. So if you don't change them, they'll be autofilled to what we place here. I'm going to make it so we have an audio clip. The sound effect that we want to play, that's mandatory. You got to fill that one. Let's make a float volume, default it to the full volume, which is going to be 1. So we can default it by saying equals 1. So if you don't change it, it will always be 1. And then we can do some pitch randomization as well. So bool pitch randomize is equal to default at true. And then default randomize option will be 10%, so 0.1f. This just changes the sound effect a little bit so it doesn't always sound the same. So audio clip.play one shot sound effects volume. That's all we need to play there. And then we're going to say audio source dot pitch is equal to 1. This just resets it if you've changed it before from calling this effect previously. I'm going to make a comment here, resets our pitch, just so it's very clear. And then right below that, we're going to say if randomized pitch. Then we're going to use a simple random.range here by saying audio source.pitch plus equals random.range minus pitch random and then pitch random. So it'll basically randomize it by minus 10% or plus 10%. Okay, that looks good. Now we can go back and use this on our take damage effect. So we can say play sound effects and we pass our physical damage sound effects. And since the rest is autofilled, we don't need to call any of the other volumes unless you want to change it or the pitch randomization. So now this is still null. So how do we get a sound effect? Well, to also make it more random, we're going to make a function to randomly select a sound effect from an array. So we can do that on the World Sound Effect Manager. We can use this very much more in the series. Public audio clip, choose random sound effects from an array. We're going to make it require an array. And again, just a couple lines of code here. Int index equals random.range 0.array length. Return array index. That's it. And you will randomly take a clip from an array that's passed through this and give it back. So then over on the take damage effect here, we can say physical damage sound effect is equal to world sound effects manager.instance.choose random sound effect from array. We pass the array from world sound effect manager.instance.physical damage sound effects. And now we save that, and that should work. We also need to call it here, so we're going to say play damage sound effects and pass our character. So let's save that. Now, if I go into the game, I know you can't hear it because I'm not recording audio, but yes, that does indeed work. It plays the sound effect on both sides. Remember that when you change stuff in your main window here, you want to save the scene so it changes in the clone also if you're not saving the prefab. And in the next video, guys, I was going to start it in this one, but we're going to touch on some animation and start our poise system. Now, the reason why I didn't do it in this video is because poise is an in-depth topic on its own. So the goal of the next couple of videos will be basically displaying an animation that will play and changing that animation depending on the intensity of the poise damage. So if you basically have a lot of poise damage, you'll play a heavier damage animation. And if you get hit from the front, you'll play a damage animation that shows you getting hit from the front. If you get hit from the side, you'll play one that shows that you're getting hit from the side, etc., etc. So it's a pretty lengthy topic, and it does warrant its own video on itself. Also, I'm sure, as a lot of you know, in light of recent events, Unity is kind of receiving some fire now. Definitely warranted also. I have my own thoughts on the matter, and I'm sure I agree with most of you. But I was asked if I'm going to continue the series, and the answer is, of course, I'm not going to stop the series. I'm going to continue it until it's complete. I love doing this, so don't worry. The series will continue uninterrupted. So if you guys learned something today, be sure to drop a like, leave a comment. It does genuinely help out the series so much. And as always, thank you very much for tuning in. I hope you all have a lovely weekend.